Thank you, Monica, Professor Veith, and the selection committee for allowing me to present this. It's going to be quick. It's basically I'm going to go over some of the things that I believe are really important for patients who have venous leg ulcers who are really not healing. There's a number of other factors, but including, like, for example, the size of the ulcer. We know that those take a lot longer than smaller ulcers. But having said that, I think that a really important factor is you begin with actually the glycocalyx, which is it's basically a very complex system on top of the endothelium. And if this gets disrupted, and most of the evidence from this actually comes from animal models. There's very little human experience in this, but from animal models, we know that if you change the shear stress by changing the flow, that all of a sudden you start activating a number of endothelial adhesion molecules. You start getting the rolling of the leukocytes, and you get adhesion of those leukocytes and penetration. As soon as you start disrupting your glycocalyx, that initiates an entire inflammatory response. And I think that's really one key factor. We don't have a great understanding, but we know it's present. We know that it's a very important, and there's actually some clinical studies with seldexide that show that there's restoration of that. This is a nice study from Tizzato that actually shows patients who they look at endothelial cells in whole sections, and you go from control at the top here, and you go through the C2, C3, and C4, and you start seeing this disarray, this organization of the endothelium as you get more inflammation. And when I look at this, and it's indirect evidence, but you start changing the shear stress, you start changing the adhesion molecules, and leukocytes and red cells starts adhering to these surfaces, and you start getting this organization, and you start getting gaps and penetration of inflammatory molecules within the tissues. So there is a lot of data on a number of cytokines, oxidative pathways. We know that oxygen radicals are present. We know that nitrogen radicals are present. And we know that there's a lot of cytokines and chemokines as well as growth factors, but also as well as metalloproteases that are available. This is just a summary of some of the data that's been looked at both in vitro and vivo in human studies and as well as in animal studies. But it's clearly present, and this is a more recent study that actually supports that from varicose vein patients and controls in blood. The reason I put the slide up is that there's a lot of other studies that I could have put up that are a little older, but show very similar that where you have inflammatory molecules that are circulating systemically, and that they're increased in patients with varicose veins at an early stage, and that there's also other studies from Tizzato that shows that actually if you correct the hemodynamics, that at 6 months, a lot of these cytokines actually go back to basal levels, actually near normal controls. So this is work from that I work with actually with Fernando Manello in Italy. And what this shows is when you look at the complexity of both cytokines, chemokines, number of growth factors, metalloproteases, inhibitors of metalloproteases, there are definitely differences between a wound that is not healing, where we define it as inflammatory, versus a wound that is healing, granulating, and that there's a whole mix of other things that are happening in between, and how this shifts between one phase or the other. That's really where we don't have a great understanding, but we know that there's pathways that push the tissues into one or the other depending on the circumstances. And we know that one basic thing is this iron. Iron metabolism is critical. So this is ferrous, but ferric iron is really detrimental to tissues, and this actually, through the Fenton reaction with hydrogen peroxide going through actually the superoxides, will actually lead to a number of activation of macrophages and then lead to cellular destruction. This is a slide from Alberto Caggiati that actually showed this in patients with, and this is ferric iron, this is F3+. And this shows that this is present, and it's only present in 4B and higher. It's not actually present in C2, and it's not present even in C3 or C4As. So why this is important is that this is extremely destructive. It is present in these individuals. And I show this because this is really the pathways that are destructive, the oxidation and nitration. I'm going to focus mainly on ONO, and this is actually the clinical evidence that it's present in venous leg ulcers. This is control. This shows two things here. It shows PAR, which is the poly-ADP ribose, and that's an indicator of DNA damage. And it's much higher in the venous leg ulcer. And this is actually elevated nitrotyrosine, which is a mechanism where it's an indicator of peroxynitrate, which is that really strong radical that actually injures mitochondria, DNA, makes a bunch of single-strand branches. It delays the repair process of wounds, and it's been shown to be elevated, but it's a normal phenomenon that occurs. It's very destructive. This kind of summarizes what I said about altered shear stress, everything that I highlighted in red. These are things that lead and drive the venous leg ulcers to not heal. And it's important that we understand that there are therapies that we can apply that can inhibit some of these pathways. That's a whole other lecture, but I really want to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.